Okay, so ready to dive into something a bit different today. We're going to ditch the usual travel guides and all that, and instead we're going to explore the legal side of things in Spain, specifically the world of real estate.
Sounds fascinating.
Yeah, I think it'll be interesting. And to do that, we've got, well, our main source is this Derecho Inmobiliario ICAT. It's a mouthful, I know, along with some other texts that really unpack the nitty-gritty of property ownership over there.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting stuff. Getting into the core legal principles that define who owns what under Spanish law. And these sources, they're pretty comprehensive. They cover everything from like the basic definition of what real property even is to all the different ways you can acquire it, the legal protections around it, the limits on ownership, even how those rights can, disappear.
Right. So this deep dive is for anyone who's ever, maybe dreamt of owning a Spanish villa, or even if you're just curious about how property boundaries are decided legally, or even if you just find this stuff, kind of interesting like me, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely.
We're going to try to break down the key concepts in a way that's clear and hopefully engaging. So
Right.
first things first, what exactly are we talking about when we say derecho inmobiliario? I mean, what falls under the umbrella of Spanish real estate law? What kind of like relationships does it govern?
Well, you can think of it as the whole set of laws that regulate the, economic and legal side of things when it comes to immovable property.
Immovable property.
Yeah, and the sources really focus on buildings, both homes and commercial spaces, but also, land that could be used for construction.
Got it. So more than just bricks and mortar, it's the whole legal web surrounding those physical assets.
Exactly.
Okay, so where do all these rules actually come from? Is there like one big book, one legal text that covers everything about Spanish property?
Not really, no. It's a bit more layered than that. Uh, the core regulations you'll find are in the civil codes,
Mhm.
but it's interesting because Spain has not only a national civil code, but also specific regional ones. So in places like Aragon, the Balearic Islands, Catalonia, Galicia, Navarre, Basque Country, they have their own sets of civil codes.
Huh.
So, kind of think of those as having some more, I guess, tailored rules on top of the national framework.
Right. So location matters, right? Like
Right.
if you're thinking of buying property in a particular region,
Huge. Yeah,
you
absolutely.
got to be aware of those regional nuances.
For sure.
Okay. And then on top of all that, you have the autonomous communities, right? They issue their own urban planning regulations.
Exactly.
So another layer.
Yeah, another layer of local rules to keep in mind.
Wow. Okay. So speaking of the Spanish Civil Code, it actually defines like what exactly immovable property is. It's probably more than just saying land and houses, right?
Oh yeah, definitely. It's much more comprehensive than that. Article 334 of the Spanish Civil Code, it actually provides this really detailed list. Of course, it includes the obvious things like the land itself, buildings, anything that's, permanently attached to the ground. But then it goes further and covers things like trees and any unharvested fruits that are still attached to the land because they're considered, an integral part of that property.
Okay, so it starts with the basics, but then it branches out.
Yeah.
What else makes it onto this list of what's legally considered immovable?
Well, you have anything that's basically fixed to the property in a way that if you took it out, you'd damage something, like built-in cabinets, for example, or tiled fixtures. Those are considered immovable. Then you also have decorative elements, things the owner might have, placed on the property with the clear intention of them being there permanently, like a statue in a garden that's anchored down, or even a fresco painted on a wall. It really comes down to the idea of, intended permanence.
So a combination of like physical attachment and the owner's intention.
Exactly.
Okay,
Yeah.
what about stuff that's less decorative and more practical?
Oh, right. The definition also includes machinery, but specifically if it's meant for the industrial or agricultural operation of the property. So you think about like equipment in a factory or on a farm that's meant to stay there that's considered immovable as well. And even manure if it's stored on agricultural land.
Manure.
Yeah.
That's pretty specific.
It's a very specific inclusion, but yeah, legally it's immovable property.
Okay. So what else is on this very exhaustive list?
Well, we're also talking about things like mines and quarries because they're, inherently connected to the land. And then docks and other constructions that are designed to, stay put, permanently fixed in a river, a lake, or along the coast. And finally, the definition even extends to things like administrative concessions for public works and easements, which are, essentially rights that someone might have over somebody else's immovable property. It really shows you how broad this definition of immovable can be in legal terms.
Wow. Okay. So immovable property in Spain. It's very specific, very thorough legal definition. Now, let's say you're interested in actually acquiring some of this legally defined immovable property. How does that usually happen? Our sources mention different ways, different form of the acquisitio ways of acquiring ownership.
Right. Well, the sources explain that, in legal terms, you acquire ownership through certain actions that are recognized by law as transferring that title. There are two main categories here. You've got original acquisition, which is basically acquiring property that didn't belong to anybody before you. Pretty rare these days.
Yeah.
And then you have derivative acquisition, which is much more common. And that's where you're basically getting the property from a previous owner.
Yeah. I was going to say original acquisition sounds more like, discovering a piece of land that's truly unclaimed,
Yeah.
like back in the, I don't know, colonial days or something.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. It's not really something that happens much in the modern world. So derivative acquisition is where most of the action is. And our sources point out a few key ways that this happens. The first, and probably the most familiar to most people, is through a sale contract. El contrato de compraventa.
The classic buy and sell.
Exactly.
Sign a contract, money changes hands, you're the new owner. Simple. Right.
Well, it's not quite instantaneous like that. While the contract itself sets up the agreement and the obligation for the seller to, transfer the property, in Spanish law, it's considered more like a title to acquire the property. The actual legal transfer of ownership, that typically happens upon delivery of the property itself.
Delivery. So that's the physical act of actually handing over the property.
Exactly. And what's important here in Spanish law is that granting a public deed, what they call escritura pública, this is done in front of a notary, is legally equivalent to delivery. It's a formal document that basically solidifies the transfer.
Okay.
And there can be other forms of delivery as well, like physically handing over the keys or even having a specific notarized act that states that delivery has been completed. But that public deed, that's a big one.
Got it. So both the formal paperwork and the actual act of handing over possession are both legally important steps.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Now, what are some things that a buyer should absolutely check, during this process to avoid any potential problems down the road?
The sources are pretty clear on a few key things. First off, you want to make sure there are no outstanding property taxes, impuesto de bienes inmuebles, on the property. You don't want to inherit someone else's tax bill.
Right.
Makes sense. And then you also want to check that the seller is current on any community fees, especially if the property is part of a horizontal property regime, like, an apartment building where there are shared common areas. You can actually get an official check on that from the community secretary.
Smart. Unpaid community fees. That could be a nasty surprise.
For sure.
Okay, so we talked about buying. What are some other ways to acquire property in Spain besides the typical sale?
Well, the Santas mentions succession, which is la sucesión en el derecho de propiedad. And that basically means inheriting property after someone passes away.
Okay, inheritance.
Right. And another important way is through donation, la donación, which is basically a gift of property.
A gift.
Yeah, a gratuitous transfer of ownership.
Someone just gives you a property.
Yeah, basically.
Wow. Lucky recipient. Are there any, rules or legal hoops you have to jump through when donating real estate?
Yeah, definitely. There are some specific formalities involved. For example, in Catalonia, they actually define a donation as an act where the donor, the person giving the property, freely disposes of it in favor of the done, the recipient. And the done has to accept it while the donor is still alive for it to be valid. But the big thing across all of Spain is that for a donation of real property to be legally binding, it has to be done through a public deed.
Okay.
So you can't just shake hands or write a note. It has to be this formal public document to make it official.
Makes sense. You want that kind of significant transfer to be clearly documented legally.
Absolutely.
Okay. Now, what about la cesión, accession? That sounds like a less common way to acquire property.
Yeah, accession is a bit more unusual, but it's basically when you acquire ownership of something because it gets attached to or incorporated into your existing property.
Mm-hmm.
Our sources break it down into two main types. Accession by production and accession by incorporation.
So, if I own an apple orchard, I own the apples that grow on the trees. Accession by production.
Exactly. That's a perfect example. The owner of, the orchard, the land, the trees, they automatically own what those trees produce, the fruit, or any income that comes from it.
Okay.
But accession by incorporation is where it gets a bit more complex.
How so?
Well, it's when you, as the owner of the property, become the owner of things that are physically joined to it. This can happen either through natural events or through things that people do, man-made additions.
Okay. Natural events like a river shifting and depositing silt that increases the size of your property.
Exactly. So alluvium, changes in a riverbed, even the formation of islands in a river, those can all lead to changes in property lines through this principle of accession. Of course, the rules get quite detailed depending on whether the river's navigable or not, or if we're talking about a river or the sea, things like that.
Nature always keeping things interesting when it comes to property lines.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay. What about man-made additions? So if I build a house on my land, or I plant trees that would fall under accession by incorporation, right?
Right, that's exactly it. That falls into the category of what they call inubile, which means going from movable to immovable.
Okay.
Basically, movable things becoming part of the immovable property. The general principle here is that whoever owns the land ends up owning whatever is built or planted on it, but there's an important caveat. They're usually obligated to compensate the owner of the materials used or the people who did the work.
Okay. But what if someone builds on land that isn't theirs or uses materials that don't belong to them?
Yeah, that gets tricky. And our sources lay out a bunch of different scenarios based on whether those actions were done in good faith, meaning they didn't know they were doing anything wrong, or in bad faith, meaning they knew they were overstepping boundaries.
Right.
So, for example, if you build on your neighbor's land thinking it's yours good faith, your neighbor might be able to choose between, paying you for the construction or making you pay for the land you built on.
Okay.
But if you did it knowing it was their land, bad faith, then the landowner has stronger rights. They might even be able to demand you demolish what you built without getting any compensation.
Yikes. Bad faith construction sounds like a costly mistake.
It definitely can be. Then there's the issue of what they call construcciones extralimitadas, constructions that go beyond your property lines.
Which I imagine is like a recipe for conflict with the neighbors.
Oh, absolutely. This usually happens when you're building on your own land, but you accidentally encroach a little bit onto your neighbor's property. And maybe there was a mistake in the surveying or the construction, something like that. Now, if the encroachment's minor and it was unintentional good faith again, and if tearing down the encroaching part would cause a lot of damage, the law might actually allow you to, in a way, acquire that little strip of your neighbor's land. But you'd have to compensate them for the land and for any damages.
Right.
But again, if it was done intentionally, bad faith, your neighbor could very well demand you tear it down.
So intent really matters in these situations.
Absolutely.
Good faith versus bad faith. A recurring theme in property disputes, I guess.
For sure.
All right.
Yeah.
Now, there's this other really interesting way to acquire property that's mentioned, la prescripción adquisitiva, acquisitive prescription, also known as usucapion.
Right.
Which to me sounds kind of like if you act like you own something for long enough, you might actually become the owner.
Yeah, that's actually a pretty good way to put it. Usucapion is basically when you acquire the ownership of a right, in this case, the right to the property, because you've continuously possessed it for a certain period of time laid out by law, as long as certain conditions are met. So yeah, if you behave like the owner for long enough and you meet these conditions, the law can actually step in and say, okay, you're the legal owner now.
So could someone move into an abandoned property and after enough time just claim it as their own? Or is there more to it than just occupying the space?
Oh, there's definitely more to it. The law's not that simple. It sets out very specific requirements for possession to actually count towards this usucapion thing. First off, it has to be in concept of owner, which means you're acting openly as if you were the real owner, not a tenant or someone there with permission. So that includes things like paying property taxes, collecting rent if there are tenants, making improvements to the property, things an owner would do.
Okay.
Then the possession has to be peaceful. So you didn't take it by force, you're not holding on to it with threats, and the real owner isn't constantly trying to get it back. It also has to be public, meaning everyone can see that you're acting as the owner. So anyone with a claim to the property would have a chance to know what's going on. And finally, it has to be uninterrupted. You can't just possess it on and off. It has to be continuous. If the real owner successfully takes legal action against you at any point, the clock kind of resets.
So there are a lot of conditions. What about how long this has to go on for? I imagine the time frame matters.
It does. You've got two main types of usucapion, and they have different time frames. You have ordinary usucapion, which has shorter time periods but also requires two extra things: good faith and a just title. Good faith means you genuinely thought you had the right to be there, maybe because you had a document you thought was valid, even if it wasn't.
Okay.
And a just title is a document that, if it was valid, would actually be enough to legally transfer ownership. So like a sale contract or a donation, even if there was some problem with it.
Okay.
Now, with ordinary usucapion, the time frames are 10 years if the real owner is around and aware of what's going on, or 20 years if they're absent, like living abroad.
Okay. And extraordinary usucapion.
Extraordinary usucapion has a longer time requirement, but you don't need good faith or a just title. Basically, the law recognizes that if someone's been openly possessing a property as the owner, peacefully and uninterruptedly for a really long time, even if they didn't have a fancy legal document, the situation should probably be sorted out.
Okay.
So the time frame for that under the National Civil Code is 30 years. And just as a side note, the Catalan Civil Code actually simplifies things and sets a single time period of 20 years for all types of usucapion.
Okay, so even without a proper document, if you act as the owner long enough and you meet the conditions, you can actually gain ownership. I mean, that's pretty wild, right?
Yeah.
It balances this need for legal certainty with the reality of long-term possession.
Yeah, it's an interesting concept for sure.
Now, when does the ownership actually legally switch over in those cases?
Well, ownership is officially acquired once that time period's up and you've met all the conditions. And the cool thing is the legal effect of that acquisition actually goes back in time to the very beginning of your possession that met those requirements. So once those years have passed and everything checks out, legally, you've been the owner since you first started possessing the property in that specific way.
Wow, that's pretty powerful.
Uh,
Okay, so let's say you've established ownership, whether it's through buying, inheriting, even this usucapion thing.
Yeah.
How does the law actually protect that ownership? And even, just the act of possessing the property. Our sources talk about protección de la posesión y de la propiedad del mueble. Mouthful, but what's that all about?
So this is where it gets interesting because Spanish law actually distinguishes between protecting the act of possession itself and protecting the right of ownership. So even if you don't have the official legal title, the law still protects your right as the person in possession to not be disturbed or kicked out without a good reason.
It's like a legal leave things as they are for whoever's in control, regardless of who might actually own it in the long run.
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it. And this protection comes partly from what they call possessory presumptions, presunciones possessorias. Basically, legal assumptions that work in your favor if you're the one in possession, meaning you don't automatically have to prove you have the right to be there. Anyone who wants to challenge you, they have to do the proving.
What kind of presumptions are we talking about here?
Well, there are a few key ones. First, there's the presumption of good faith, which means you're legally assumed to be acting in good faith, that you believe you have the right to be there unless someone can prove otherwise. Then there's the presumption of continuity of possessory concept, which means your possession is assumed to have the same character as it did when you first got there. So, for example, if you started out as a tenant, you're legally presumed to still be a tenant unless there's clear evidence of a change, like a purchase agreement or something. And there's the presumption of continuity of possession itself. If you can prove you possessed it in the past and you possess it now, you're assumed to have possessed it continuously in between.
Okay.
And finally, there's the presumption of legitimate possession, which is a big one. If you're possessing the property like you're the owner, the law assumes that your possession is legitimate and that you have a just title to it.
Oh, yeah.
This means the person in possession, acting as the owner, doesn't have to prove ownership right off the bat. It's on anyone else who claims ownership to come forward with better proof.
Wow. So, legally speaking, being in physical possession really puts you in a strong position.
It does, but it goes further than that. The law also gives anyone who's being disturbed in their possession or who's actually been dispossessed the right to take legal action to get their possession back or to protect it. And they can do this just based on the fact that they were in possession before without even having to prove full ownership right away.
That's pretty powerful.
Yeah, it is. And this is where interdicts come in interdictos, which are special legal procedures designed to be fast and effective.
Interdicts.
Yeah. So what are the main types? Well, you have the interdicto de recuperar, which is basically an action to recover possession. This is for someone who's been kicked out of a property and they want to get back in based on the fact that they were there before. They generally just have to prove they were in possession at the time they were dispossessed, and they have to act quickly within a year of being dispossessed to make their claim. The second type is the interdicto de retener, which is an action to retain possession. This one's for someone who's currently being messed with or threatened with being kicked out, and they want the court to step in and stop it so they can stay put. In this case, they have to prove they're currently in possession, that someone's interfering, and again, they usually have a year from that interference to take action.
So these interdicts are basically quick legal tools for dealing with immediate disruptions to possession.
Exactly.
Okay. Now, what about protecting the actual full right of ownership? Like, what legal options does the real owner have?
Right. So for the actual owner, there are a few key legal actions they can take. One of the most important is the action reivindicatoria, the reivindicatory action. This is basically when the owner, whose right to use, enjoy, and possess their property is being challenged or violated by someone else, they can go to court to get their ownership officially recognized and to get their property back. To win this kind of case, they usually have to show strong proof of their ownership, clearly identify the property, and prove that the person who's currently possessing it has no right to be there. If that person claims to have some sort of title, the owner might have to challenge that title in court as well.
So it's the main legal weapon for an owner to get their property back.
Pretty much. And then you have the action negatoria, the negatory action. This one's interesting because it lets the owner go to court to get a declaration that their property isn't subject to some right or encumbrance that someone else is claiming to have over it.
Like what?
It could be an easement, a lien, something like that. The owner can also ask the court to make that other person stop making those claims or trying to exercise those supposed rights. To win a negatory action, the owner usually has to prove they own the property, show that it should be free from that claimed right, and show that the other person's claim is causing them some kind of problem. Then you have the acción de cerramiento de fincas, the action for enclosure. This one reinforces the owner's right to put up a physical barrier around their property.
So fences, walls, those sorts of things.
Exactly. And they might need to use this action if a neighbor or someone else is stopping them from establishing clear boundaries around their land.
Okay, so you have legal tools for clearing your title and for physically marking your property.
Right. And then there's the acción de deslind y amojonamiento, the action for demarcation and boundary marking. This is super important for sorting out any confusion or arguments about where exactly the boundaries lie between properties. Deslind is figuring out the exact dividing line, usually through surveying and legal documents. Amojonamiento is the actual placing of physical markers, like boundary stones, to clearly show where that boundary is on the ground.
Okay, so it's about making those boundaries official, both on paper and in the real world.
Exactly. Our sources also mention other protective measures like the interdicto de obra nueva, an action to stop any new construction on a neighbor's property that might harm your property rights, like blocking a view or encroaching on your land.
Right.
And there's the interdicto de obra ruinosa, where you can demand the demolition or repair of a really rundown building on a neighbor's property if there's a risk of it collapsing and damaging your property.
So there are lots of ways for owners to protect their interests.
The law gives them a whole toolbox of options.
Okay. But as we mentioned earlier, ownership isn't absolute. It's not like you can just do whatever you want with your property. Our sources talk about limitations on ownership, limitaciones del dominio.
Right. That's a really important part of property law. While ownership gives you a lot of rights to use, enjoy, dispose of your property, those rights aren't unlimited. There are boundaries, usually for the sake of public interest or to make sure different property owners and the community can coexist peacefully.
So your rights stop where someone else's begin, basically.
Exactly. That's the most basic limitation. And beyond that, there's a whole framework of laws and regulations that put restrictions on what you can do. Zoning laws that dictate what you can build, rules about when businesses can operate, building codes for safety and structural standards, laws about how agricultural land can be used, regulations protecting public spaces, all those things limit what an owner can do with their property.
Right, so it's about striking a balance between individual rights and what's good for everyone.
Exactly, and it can get quite specific. For example, there are limitations related to historical heritage. Limitaciones por razón del patrimonio histórico.
Which would be for properties that are, culturally or historically important.
Right. These are properties that have been officially recognized as bienes de interés cultural, BIC, because of their historical, artistic, scientific, or cultural value. So think of historical monuments, important gardens, archaeological sites, things like that. And even the process of considering a property for BIC status can lead to a freeze on building or demolition permits. Once a property gets that BIC designation, it's basically considered part of the historical fabric, and it can't be moved. Owners face a lot of restrictions on what they can change, inside or outside, and they often need special permission even for urgent repairs. And things like advertising or putting up antennas on these protected monuments, those are usually no-goes to preserve their appearance.
Makes sense. You wouldn't want someone, just slapping a billboard on a historical landmark.
Exactly.
Okay. What about limitations because of public roads? Vias públicas.
Ah, yes. Well, the laws governing public roads, they create different zones along the roadside, each with its own set of rules, all aimed at ensuring public safety and keeping the roads functioning properly. So first you have the public domain zone, which includes the road itself, plus a strip of land on either side. For highways, it's usually 8 meters. For other roads, 3 meters.
Good.
Within this zone, the government can actually expropriate land if they need to build or improve the road. And any work that a property owner wants to do in this zone needs special permission.
So stricto controls the closer you are to the road.
Yeah. Then there's the easement zone, which is 2 strips of land that border the public domain, 25 meters for highways, 8 meters for other roads. Now, building and changing how the land's used in this zone, that's only allowed if it doesn't mess with road safety and if it's been specifically approved.
Okay.
But interestingly, you can generally cultivate the land in this zone without permission as long as you don't plant anything that could create a safety hazard on the road.
So farming's okay, but building a house is not.
Right.
Okay. And what about further away from the road?
You have the affectation zone, which extends out another 100 meters for highways, 50 meters for other roads. Anything you want to do in the zone building, changing the land use, even planting or cutting down trees, you need permission first.
Okay, so even if your property's not right next to the road, its proximity to public infrastructure still comes with a whole bunch of limitations.
Yeah, definitely.
Now, Spain has a lot of coastline, so I imagine limitations on coastal properties are a big deal.
Absolutely. Límites por razón de las costas. Limits due to coastal zones. Those are super important. Basically, any property along the coast is subject to this whole set of rules meant to protect what they call the public maritime terrestrial domain.
Which is?
It's a pretty broad term. It includes the shore, the beach, dunes, the territorial sea, even things like internal waters and the resources of the economic zone and the continental shelf. There's this zone called the Public Maritime Terrestrial Domain Protection Zone, the boundaries of which are set based on things like the high tide line and where the waves reach. The main goal is to protect this zone, to make sure people aren't building things or doing things that could harm it.
Okay, that's the public area. What about private properties next to it?
So private properties that border this zone, they're subject to different easement zones. You have the protection easement zone, which goes 100 meters inland from the edge of the shore. In this zone, you can't build houses, you can't build major transport infrastructure, you can't extract things like sand or gravel, no overhead power lines, no dumping waste, no advertising, lots of restrictions.
Wow, okay. So there's a strong emphasis on, preserving the natural character of the coast.
Yeah, for sure.
What else?
Then there's the transit easement zone, which is a narrower strip 6 meters inland from the shore. This one has to be kept totally clear for public access so people can walk along the coast, and for vehicles like those used by surveillance or rescue teams.
Okay, so public access is a major priority.
Absolutely. And then you have the servidumbre de acceso al mar, the right of access to the sea. This means that any property next to the coast has to allow public access to the sea.
Makes sense.
In developed areas, they actually have specific rules for how often there have to be access points for vehicles and pedestrians, all clearly marked. And finally, there's the influence zone, which goes out at least 500 meters from the shore. This zone is subject to various rules meant to protect maritime terrestrial domain, like regulations about parking near the beach and making sure there aren't any architectural barriers that would stop people from getting to the coast.
Okay, so owning property near the Spanish coast comes with a whole host of responsibilities towards the public and the environment.
It does. And it's not just the coast. There are also limits related to public waterways, like rivers and lakes. Límite por razón del dominio público hidráulico.
Right.
Similar to coastal areas, any land next to a riverbank has certain restrictions, again, to protect the water and make sure people can use it. You have the public use easement, which is a 5-meter strip along the bank that has to be left open for things like surveillance, fishing, rescue operations, mooring boats. You can plant non-woody vegetation there, but no permanent structures.
Okay.
And then there's the police zone, which usually goes 100 meters out from the riverbank. Any major changes to the land in this zone, extraction of materials, construction, that all needs permission from the authorities.
Got it. So again, restrictions to ensure public access and protect the natural environment around the water.
Exactly.
Okay. Our sources also talk about limitaciones del contenido del dominio, which are limitations on the content of ownership itself. And they
Hmm.
specifically mention servidumbres, or easements.
Right. Easements are a big deal. Basically, they're rights that one person has over someone else's property. They create a kind of limitation or burden on the owner of that property. And these easements can be either legal, meaning they're set by law, or voluntary, meaning they're agreed upon between the property owners, like in a contract.
Okay, so what are some common examples of these legal easements?
Well, one that comes up a lot